What's up YouTube? I've got 5 tips for editing audio in Cubase. Let's dive in and have a look. So firstly, I want to look at importing loops and samples into the project and a couple of basic principles to keep in mind when doing so. Firstly, I want to look at importing something like a loop that might not necessarily be at the tempo of the project that we're working in, and looking at how we can adjust the tempo to suit what we're doing a little bit better. So I've got a couple of bongo/conga loops over here, and I'm just going to import one for now, and we're going to work with it and see if we can fit it into the context of this track. What I want to do is, just to simplify things a little bit, I'm just going to copy just the kick drum over, and let's look at how this kind of syncs up. So it's obviously not in time, pretty evident. So what we can do is we can double click on the sample, and this opens up the audio editor window within Cubase. Over here, we've got different panels, each one representing kind of like a different part of the workflow. Audio warp would be warping things sort of linearly in time. Very audio would be to do with like the pitch and stuff like that. Hit points is for slicing samples up and that kind of thing. So first things first, I think what's one of the most important things is to kind of determine the tempo of the file that we're working with. And there's various ways of doing this. You could either solo it, select the sample, press P, and then let it loop while you kind of count the tempo using various BPM counters and that kind of thing. But often what happens is, because of the way that it's recorded, some of the hits aren't exactly in time and that kind of thing. There's a slightly easier way to do this. What I want to do is just select this whole bar with my kick in as well. And then let's head over to this audio warp mode, and let's select musical mode. So what it's done is it's basically automatically detected the sample's tempo. It says here 118.46. We can verify that, or we can warp things to see how it fits. What I want to do is just make the sample a little bit, the loop a little bit smaller. Here, let's just see if it's automatically shifted things nicely on the beat. So it's got very, very close. In fact, I think that's close enough for us to actually just use as a starting point here. So there are some of the hits that aren't quite on the beat, and when you're making kind of the faster dance music, sometimes you don't want things to be to have too much groove or too much kind of offset, because it kind of destroys the kind of rhythmic grid of the entire arrangement, if you know what I mean. Obviously, if you do want more groove and more swing, then you can kind of ignore this, but I find it really helpful to actually use this free warp tool. And what you can do is you can put in like a grid line for each of these hits and shift it to exactly on the grid. So we could actually get really, really technical and do it for every single hit in the loop, or we could kind of just do it for these main hits here and let the groove fit in with the rest of the stuff. If you've placed a warp in the wrong point, you can hold Control, and that brings up the eraser tool to just like remove the warp so you can make it a bit cleaner. So if the sample was slightly wrong, if it had like detected it wrong, we could punch in a manual value over here, and then it'll detect from there, if that makes sense. I think that kind of nailed it. That sounds perfect to me. So now I want to look at hit points. So what I want to do is I actually want to just re-import that exact same file. So we're going to have this version, which is the kind of warped version, and this is the natural version. With this one, what we can do is we can actually double click and open up this hit points panel. So over here, you've got a threshold parameter. And as you can see, as you adjust this, it kind of like creates these like grid lines. So what we can do here is adjust the threshold, use this create slices like this. So what it's done is it's basically sliced the audio sample into a bunch of samples and arranged it on the grid for us. Similar to warping in that you're kind of like adjusting things to fit better in the groove, But when you're using hit points and offsetting it each individually as samples, you're not actually warping any of these sounds in pitch or anything like that. So you get a little bit more of a natural sound. That being said, is sometimes it's a little bit harder to kind of get these things to kind of roll from one sound to another, because there might be, I guess if we're speeding up the tempo, it's often not going to be the case. But, you know, say for example, you've got like a bit of the next sample playing here before the one sample plays, if that makes sense. But anyway. Then we can just go and hit this, select them all and hit this Q button over there, and that just quantizes all of them to exactly on the grid. And then I just like to jump in and just clean up each of these so that they're, you know, not overlapping. We don't have parts like this which are starting just before the sample. So how we can fix this is if you hold Control Alt, the mouse cursor changes to this little icon. You can actually then drag these this exact sample within the timeline. So we could potentially remove this and then drag it like this to like clean up that sample and get really, really technical with it. So yeah, I'm just diving in here and cleaning up all of these little the overlaps here, and then we can just create a fade out on all of the samples just to make sure that everything is clean. And now we can compare to see which one sounds better. You see, often when warping percussion loops, you get a bit of this phasey thing going on because of the way that the transients are being stretched. That's why this hit points tool is such a powerful system within Cubase. So that's sounding nice and clean. I'm going to bounce that out. Another thing you can do within hit points, I guess this is not as usable within like Psytrance and that kind of thing, but there is something really cool I think I should show you guys, which you could use potentially to create like rhythms and that kind of thing that might be slightly off the grid to create grooves. Anyway, what I want to do is let's just make sure that this sample, this is a different sample now. I'm just going to go musical mode and let's just see how this syncs up here. Cool, so that's, it is in tempo, but there's some of these slight kind of variations here and there. What we can do is we can use those slight variations to create a kind of groove pattern that we can sync other elements in the track to. So let's say, for example, go hit points. Let's adjust this threshold so that we're getting all of these hits, and then go create groove. It's created this quantized preset that's named the same as our sample that we had. So let's say, for example, jump into, I want to see if I've got a percussion here with a closed hat. Cool. I'm just going to copy this and make it a bit smaller. And we can open this up and let's quantize the closed hats to the groove that we extracted from that sample. And you'll see it's kind of slightly shifted things off. Although, like I said, when I'm doing full on, I find because I've got such a transient bass that's kind of quantized to the grid, when doing these like groovy things that are kind of too much off the grid, you kind of, it becomes a little bit too obvious. So I tend to avoid that kind of thing, but it's still a really, really nice thing to know about in case you are wanting to create something that's a bit more groovy. Okay, let's look at some finer editing details. I want to look at processing these samples. And one of the coolest things within Cubase is the ability to not only process regions of a sample with different processes, you can also do it with different kind of effects and that kind of thing. First and foremost, I want to show you guys the range selection tool. So I don't use this too often, to be honest with you, but I think it's still an important thing to know about. I kind of prefer the workflow of using the scissors and slicing regions and then bouncing them. Well, let's say, for example, I actually want to quantize. Let's say select this region over here, then right click and then apply a process or something to just that region. So I want to show you guys a couple of the different processes that you get within Cubase. There's obviously a bunch, but I mean, most of the ones that I use in my kind of like regular workflow. Envelope is particularly cool, especially for creating automations and that kind of thing, I generally don't like to automate the volume on my mixer channels, because then when it comes to the mix, when you adjust it, it kind of throws the whole thing off. So doing movements and stuff like written onto the actual audio file is an incredibly powerful kind of technique. So you'll see here, as you kind of adjust it here, it like updates it live on the sample. So we could use this to, for example, like remove tails from sounds, or anything, just like a volume kind of automation. And as you see, as you edit it here, it kind of like auto applies it onto the region, which is particularly helpful. So in parts where you have like a clip, or a part where you may not want like the peak of, for example, this to be playing over kick drum, we could go in and process an envelope, or we could just process a fade in. It's a little bit simpler for that kind of thing. I guess you get fade in, envelope, and fade out. Envelope allows you to do fade ins, outs, and everything in between. And then the fade in and fade outs are just a little bit more kind of specific. So anyway, that's the region tool. Like I said, I kind of prefer this using the scissor tool and cutting the little bits, and this then allows us to go in and, for example, bounce each part. I've actually got a hotkey, Control-Shift-B, and now we can like select all of these and, for example, process something like a normalize. And now what it's going to do is it's going to make sure all of these samples are at the same volume. I think that's a bit loud. We can go down to like let's say -6 here. And as you see, it like live updates on the actual sample. I think that's even still a bit loud. Yeah, let's see how this works. So now all these hits will be at the same volume. We've added these kind of like envelopes and fade-ins. So they're still a little bit loud. What we can do is we can actually just manually use this clip volume to change the volume on these. Just a little bit simpler than opening it up and processing it. So here, for example, we might not want this tail. We can actually just use the scissor tool, cut that out, or we could actually apply a fade in, a fade out, or an envelope or something like that. Or we could use the range selection tool, select it, and there's even a process called silence, which essentially just, boom, silences that part. And then we can create a fade out on this part over here, for example. Process, fade out, and we can draw in our own custom curve. So as you can see, it's insane the amount of audio editing and that kind of thing that you can do within simple regions. And it's not just limited to those kind of simple processes. We've got plugins, so we can apply plugins to just specific regions of an audio file. And this is incredibly powerful for a kind of like I know Infected Mushroom do this kind of thing a lot, where they have this kind of, it almost sounds like sound is running through a bunch of different or effects racks and stuff sequentially. So I want to see if I can kind of replicate that kind of thing, maybe with this Congo loop as well. What we can do is, for example, highlight some of the, in regions, we can just process plugins onto these. So I'm just going to go through and apply random of these creative presets from within the Snap Heap Factory preset to different regions on this drum loop and see, what happens. Cool. The next thing I want to talk about is per sample editing and zero crossings. So zero crossings is the points at which the wave crosses this line. So if you want to always have a kind of clean cut in a sample, it's a good idea to enable this snap to zero crossings point. So when you adjust these kind of end tails, it'll always be at a point where the sample crosses that line. Does that make sense? So it'll always be at a 0 point. Another thing that's also really handy, although a little bit of a tricky method, is per sample editing. So you can actually zoom in really, really in depth in Cubase and actually edit samples individually here. So for example, if you've got a sample which you can't get to a point where there's a zero crossing, you can create a zero crossing by just turning the first sample down. So this is a bit hacky and doesn't always work, but if you kind of need a point at which the sample goes to 0, you can literally just draw it in. So like I said, sometimes this is a bit hacky and it can kind of sometimes create clicks, but that being said, is you might need to use that, and it's a very kind of advanced technique. Okay, so I want to talk about a little bit more of an advanced technique, and that would be extracting vocals from a track, like a sort of finished MP3 or WAV track. So there are various legalities involved in this that I don't really want to get to in this video. You can do a lot of research on that. That being said, is this track I actually produced with a friend of mine, Jose, from Malawi. This one actually was on the radio in Malawi and stuff, but I own the rights to it, so I'm perfectly welcome to, show you guys and extract things and use them in my own material. Anyway, I want to show you guys this track, and I want to show you guys how we could use a thing in the later versions of Cubase Pro called Spectra Layers to actually extract the vocals from a full track, which we could, add to our track or process in various ways.
Me I go make it. Whatever it is, I truly learn from my past and my present mistakes. Me lost no friends. Me want me have a next a big shout out. Me send out to me true friends. Fire, only my face and only my snakes who want me to fill them heart breaks. Just shame them want break them on next. I can pay them 1,000 nation and a million.
Anyway, what a vibe. So I just want to cut like some of the parts out there. I don't want to use the whole track because that's obviously a lot of processing power, just so I can show you guys an example here. So how to open Spectra Layers is you right click and then you've got this thing called extensions and you open it like that. So it should pop up another window. It does take a bit of time. There we go. So here what we can do is we can click here at the top, layer, and we can click unmix vocals. It pops up a window over here where you can punch in the sensitivity. I generally just leave it at 0. It does a pretty good job like that. And then we just leave it. Okay. Takes quite a bit of CPU usage. So here, as you can see, it's basically given us 2 layers. Piano, drums, bass, and other, and vocals. And what we can do is we can literally just hit this mute. And we have just the vocals.
The big shout out, me send out to me true friends. Fire, only my face and only my snakes who want me to fill them heart breaks. Just shame them want break them on next.
So as you can see, it's kind of picked up some of those instruments and stuff. But that being said, those sensitivities settings you can adjust those. I'm not going to go in there because I'm busy using the OBS and stuff. The CPU is crazy. But what I want to do here is bounce this so that we've got just the vocals kind of like bounced out here. And then what we can do is we can figure out the tempo that we had of this track, and then we can figure out the key and try to fit a part of this into the kind of Psytrance bassline thing, maybe add some effects and some processing and see, what we can do here. Another thing I should probably mention is that Cubase has a sort of tap tempo beat calculator that helps to figure out the tempo of samples and that kind of thing. It's over here in the project beat calculator, and then you click tap tempo, and then it pops up this window, and you just click over here, and it tells you what the BPM of your clicks are. So you can play the sample, click it in, and see what happens. So I tapped it out, and it said it was 104, so I'm going to punch in 104 over here. Let's just pull over some of our kick drums, so we can just see if we can loop it to a tempo here, see how close we can get. So we will want to go musical mode so that it warps it to the tempo. I've chopped bits that I thought sounded cool, applied a bit of color copy delay, a little bit of EQ there. Now I want to look at a thing called Vary Audio, which actually allows us to analyze and shift the pitch of each of these vocal phrases to maybe suit something a little bit more sort of tonal to what we're doing. So this track is in F sharp, and I think you can see like a lot of these vocal things are hovering around the C region. So what we can do is we can actually go in and edit each of these individually. So I've done a video with slightly more advanced techniques with this Vary Audio. If you are interested, you should definitely check out, search my channel for that. Here, what I'm attempting to do is just to shift everything to closer to the C, and then what we're going to do is shift it to the F sharp, either upwards or downwards. We'll see which one sounds the best. So here what we can do is you can see there's still a little bit of kind of differences in between them. Okay, this one is quite a lot up. Okay, so we can select all and we can just say quantize pitch. So this is going to take these notes and shift them closer to the exact pitch. Or if you think it's like a bit too kind of apparent and a bit too, obviously like robotic, we can actually just undo everything that we've done. And what we can do is we can actually just shift it so that the C correlates to the root note of what we're working in. So it would be F sharp. Anyways, you guys get the idea. I hope you guys enjoyed that. Let me know what you think in the comments. As always, if you haven't yet, hit that like button, hit that subscribe button. See you guys next time. Cheers.